St. Matthew Hospital erupted into chaos when Owen Carter, a black single father working as an equipment technician, suddenly forced his way into a locked operating room. Security dragged him out. The hospital's new executive director fired him in front of dozens of staff members, and the head surgeon publicly declared that Owen had endangered a patient's life. But that same night, restored security footage told a different story. Owen had seen a detail every single doctor in that room had missed, and the person who wanted the patient dead was standing inside that operating room the entire time. Stay until the end to find out exactly who Owen saved and why the hospital eventually bowed its head to apologize to him. The story begins 6 hours before Owen was fired, on a morning that started at St. Matthew like any other. He arrived early, as he always did, checking the anesthesia machines and the medical gas lines feeding into the surgical wing. He worked quietly and precisely, recording the serial number of every component he touched, a habit that had never once failed him in 14 years of service. His badge read only equipment technician, nothing more, and to many of the younger doctors passing through the corridors, that title made him invisible, a man who fixed machines, rather than a man who understood them better than anyone else in the building. Lucas Morgan, the head of cardiac surgery, was preparing for an important procedure that morning on a patient named David Harrison, a 61-year-old independent auditor who had been hired by the hospital's board to review its operating costs. When Owen inspected the anesthesia machine in operating room 3, he noticed that the pressure regulation valve had recently been replaced, but its serial number did not match anything on the hospital's approved equipment list. The part showed no visible damage, yet Owen caught a faint scratch where an old identification code appeared to have been sanded away. He asked that preparation for the surgery be paused so the valve could be checked more thoroughly. Lucas brushed the concern aside, insisting Owen was overreacting to nothing, and the anesthesiologist, Jessica Lane, added that the machine had already passed its automated diagnostic test. It was a familiar pattern for Owen, one he had learned to live with quietly over the years. He was not a doctor, and in a building built on hierarchy, that single fact seemed to matter more to some people than everything he actually knew about keeping a patient alive. He had served as a combat medic technician before coming to St. Matthew, trained to read the smallest signs of trouble long before a monitor ever caught up to reality, and he had lost his wife years earlier to a medical error that had been quietly buried rather than corrected. That loss had reshaped him into a man who checked twice, documented everything, and refused to let silence protect anyone at a patient's expense. Owen was not convinced. Quietly, without making another scene, he photographed the serial number and saved the image to his phone, a small act of caution shaped by years of trusting his own eyes over a screen. Before the room filled with the rest of the surgical team, his daughter Mia called to ask when he would be home. He promised her he would be back after his shift ended, though his attention never fully left that suspicious valve, gleaming under fresh paint. David was wheeled into operating room 3 not long after, having quietly hidden a storage drive containing financial records inside a drawer, meant only for personal belongings. Jason Whitmore, the hospital's chief operating officer, appeared outside the room under the pretense of caring about an important auditor's welfare, though he kept asking whether David would be conscious again immediately after the surgery, a question that struck no one as strange at the time. Grace Bennett, the hospital's newly appointed executive director, was in an investor meeting and had no idea anything was wrong. Owen went down to the equipment storage room to cross-check delivery records, and there he discovered that the serial number on the anesthesia valve belonged to a batch of components recalled 3 years earlier for causing dangerous errors in oxygen readings. By the time he returned to the surgical wing, the procedure had already begun, and the operating room door had been sealed according to sterile protocol. He called the internal line and asked Jessica to verify the oxygen levels independently rather than relying solely on the monitor's display. But Lucas, irritated by the interruption, told her to end the call and continue working. Minutes later, the monitor still showed stable oxygen readings, Yet, through the glass, Owen noticed the color of the blood moving through the circulation tubing had turned unusually dark. His years in military medical service told him something the machine refused to admit, that the patient might be starving for oxygen, even while every digital number claimed otherwise. He asked a nurse outside to trigger a technical alert, and that was the moment Jason reappeared, declaring loudly that Owen had no authority to interfere and ordering security to hold him back, framing his warning as nothing more than an unverified guess from an anxious technician. Then the vital signs alarm sounded inside the operating room. David's heartbeat had begun to spiral into dangerous irregularity, and Owen understood they had only minutes left before his heart could stop entirely. Using the emergency access code reserved for senior technicians, he unlocked the door and moved straight to the anesthesia machine, never once touching the sterile surgical field. He cut the supply line running from the faulty valve and switched the system to a backup oxygen tank, and it was in that exact instant that security caught up to him and pulled him out before he could explain a single word of what he had just done. Inside the room, the true oxygen reading climbed immediately, and David's heartbeat began to steady, though the surgical team still had no understanding of why. Just before he was pulled through the door, Owen caught a glimpse of Jason quietly peeling a small label off a supply crate and slipping it into his jacket pocket, a detail no one else in that hallway seemed to notice or care about. Once David's condition had stabilized, Jason moved fast to control the narrative before anyone else could question what had actually happened. He announced that Owen had barged into a sterile operating room without authorization, disrupting the procedure and nearly costing the patient his life, a claim delivered with such calm confidence that few in the hallway thought to challenge it. Lucas, still shaken from the emergency, had not yet learned the valve was defective and confirmed to hospital staff that Owen had entered without permission, unintentionally lending Jason's version of events the weight of a surgeon's word. Grace was pulled out of her investor meeting and given only Jason's one-sided account before she had a chance to review anything herself. Owen tried to explain the recalled component, but Jason insisted the storage database contained no record of any such recall, a claim that sounded reasonable to everyone unfamiliar with how quietly these things could be buried. When Owen opened his phone to show the photograph of the serial number, he discovered the image had already vanished from the hospital's synchronized employee folder, as if someone had reached into his files before he ever had the chance to use them. Standing in a crowded hallway in front of dozens of watching employees, Grace announced Owen's immediate suspension pending an investigation. Jason pressed harder, warning that investors would pull their funding if the hospital did not respond decisively to what looked like an unauthorized intrusion into a sterile surgical space. Under that pressure, Grace's suspension hardened into an outright termination on the spot, and Owen's employee badge was confiscated within minutes. 2 security guards escorted him through the main lobby while employees stared, and a few quietly filmed the scene on their phones. And rumors spread within the hour that an unstable technician had tried to sabotage a surgery. No one paused to ask why a man with 14 years of spotless service would suddenly risk everything for no reason. No one asked what he might have seen. In the space of a single morning, an entire career built on quiet competence had been reduced to a single accusation, repeated so often by the time Owen reached the parking lot that it had already begun to sound like fact. Owen did not resist any of it. He only asked that the hospital preserve the anesthesia machine and avoid replacing any of its parts until an independent inspector could examine it, a request Jason answered coldly by promising the equipment would be handled through internal procedure, which everyone understood meant it would quietly disappear. Abigail Reed, the head of hospital security, watched Owen leave and noticed something that didn't sit right with her. He hadn't tried to run, hadn't threatened anyone, and had never actually approached the surgical table the way Jason's report claimed. Before stepping out through the main doors, Owen turned back and looked directly into one of the hallway cameras, telling Abigail quietly that the truth was still sitting somewhere inside the security system, as long as no one had managed to erase it yet. When Abigail checked the footage that night, the exact segment showing Owen entering the operating room had already disappeared from the hospital's main server, a discovery that told her far more than any official report ever could. Later that evening, Abigail discovered that 17 minutes of footage were missing from three separate locations at once: the equipment storage room, the hallway outside the operating suite, and the hospital's rear delivery entrance. Data vanishing from three places simultaneously could not reasonably be explained as a technical glitch. When she checked the login history, the deletion command traced back to an administrative account belonging to Jason's office, though it had been accessed from an unidentified device that made a direct accusation impossible for now. Rather than confront anyone immediately, Abigail quietly backed up whatever footage remained before filing any report, unwilling to let more evidence slip away while she gathered proof. Meanwhile, Owen returned to his small apartment and kept the details vague when Mia asked what had happened, telling her only that something had gone wrong at work, a brief and gentle moment that marked the only real appearance the little girl would make in this story. Once she was asleep, Owen opened his personal laptop and found an automatic backup created by the hospital's maintenance software before the deletion occurred, revealing that his photograph of the serial number had synced to his own private account only moments before it disappeared from the hospital's system entirely. He cross-referenced the serial number again and confirmed without doubt that the valve belonged to the recalled batch. Not long after, Abigail called Owen on his personal number, explaining that although the primary camera system had been wiped, an older backup server still existed, one that only stored footage in low resolution, but had somehow been overlooked. The two met at an all-night diner, where Owen showed her the evidence linking the valve to the counterfeit component recall. Abigail revealed something of her own, that the rear delivery camera had captured an unmarked truck arriving at 3 in the morning with no company logo, and the person who signed for the delivery worked directly under Jason in the operations department. Together they began to understand this was no accident, but something built with intention. Piece by piece, Abigail restored the backup footage, silent video that showed Owen glancing through the glass, checking a secondary monitor, and only then using his emergency code to enter the operating room, exactly as he had described. More importantly, the same footage captured Jason standing beside the technical supply cabinet only minutes before the surgery began. He opened it, removed a small object, and adjusted the position of a tubing line, an action too brief and unclear to prove intent on its own, but more than enough to expose the gaps in Jason's official account of that morning. In the final frame before the recording cut out, Jason turned and looked directly into the camera lens, almost as if some part of him already knew exactly what he was doing was being recorded. Abigail replayed that final frame 3 times before she said anything at all, studying the way Jason's eyes lingered on the lens for just a beat too long. It was not the look of a man caught by accident. It was the look of someone who had done this kind of thing before and simply trusted that no one would ever bother checking. Owen sat across from her at the diner counter with his coffee going cold, turning the pieces over in his mind: the recalled valve, the unmarked truck, the missing 17 minutes. The way Jason had appeared outside the operating room, asking a question no relative or colleague would ever think to ask. None of it added up to carelessness. All of it pointed toward a plan someone had built carefully, piece by piece, counting on the fact that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. Owen began asking why a dangerous component would appear specifically in David's surgery and no one else's. Abigail pulled visitor logs and discovered that Jason had accessed David's hospital room twice before the operation ever took place. Grace, meanwhile, was informed that David remained unconscious well past the point his procedure should have allowed, and Jason kept pressing her to sign a formal statement blaming Owen for the complication, a document that had been prepared with suspicious speed, almost as though it existed before the investigation had even started. Lucas reviewed the anesthesia data again on his own and realized the oxygen readings displayed on the monitor did not match the results from David's actual blood gas test, proof that the entire system had been feeding the surgical team false numbers throughout the procedure. It confirmed exactly what Owen had tried to warn them about hours earlier. Lucas requested the anesthesia machine be preserved for a full investigation, only to learn it had already been removed from the operating room under Jason's direct order. Owen and Abigail made their way to David's office, where they learned he had been auditing procurement contracts worth tens of millions of dollars across the hospital system. His assistant, Eleanor Price, revealed that David had uncovered a long pattern of payments to a company called Meridian Clinical Supply, whose registered address turned out to be nothing more than a rented mailbox, and whose legal representative had once been a business partner of Jason's. Before his surgery, David had told Eleanor he intended to present his full findings to the board immediately afterward. Owen realized the defective valve might not have been an accident at all, but a way to disguise a murder as an ordinary surgical complication. He also understood that Jason was actively trying to frame him, knowing a recently fired black technician made a convenient scapegoat, especially with Jason controlling access to every equipment record that could prove otherwise. Grace quietly summoned Abigail to her office and asked, without revealing everything she knew, why the missing footage had been deleted using Jason's own credentials. She immediately ordered the remaining data locked down and additional protection placed around David. Word of that decision reached Jason through a loyal staff member, and he understood his window of time was closing fast. That same night, a nurse received a falsified transfer order moving David to a different recovery unit, carrying an electronic signature that belonged to Lucas, though Lucas had never approved any such transfer. Owen realized the person behind all of this was preparing a second attempt, one that would not require anesthesia equipment at all. Abigail alerted Owen to the suspicious transfer order, and although he had already been banned from entering St. Matthew, he continued offering technical guidance from outside its walls. He pointed out that if David were moved to the hospital's older recovery wing, the monitoring equipment there still ran on a network vulnerable to outside interference. Grace canceled the transfer immediately, but only minutes later, the electrical system on the recovery floor lost signal entirely, and the backup generator failed to activate within its required window. Owen recognized the failure as identical to an issue he had documented in a maintenance report 3 months earlier, a report Jason had closed without ever authorizing the repair. Grace, left with no other choice, allowed Owen back into the hospital as an emergency consultant, though Jason had not yet been told. Abigail brought him in through the staff technical entrance, and inside the generator room he found a switch deliberately locked into test mode. Owen restored power just before the backup battery keeping David's ventilator running was set to fail completely. In the recovery unit, a man dressed as an orderly approached David's room carrying an unlabeled syringe. Abigail intercepted him before he could reach the door, and though he fled toward the stairwell, hospital security caught him within minutes. Under questioning, the man admitted he had been paid to introduce a substance capable of triggering a fatal heart arrhythmia, though he claimed he had never learned the identity of the person who hired him. Only instructions delivered through a disposable phone. A message on that phone made brief reference to the technician, confirming that Owen himself had become a target as well. Abigail sat with that detail for a long moment, realizing that the danger had never truly ended the day Owen was walked out through the lobby. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for a moment when no one was watching closely enough to notice a second attempt taking shape. Standing before Grace, Lucas openly admitted that Owen's actions inside the operating room had saved David's life, and Grace realized her hasty decision to fire him had unintentionally helped Jason bury the evidence. She apologized to Owen privately, but he refused to accept a quiet apology for a humiliation that had happened in full public view. He told her plainly that his job was not the priority right now, keeping David alive long enough to speak the truth was. Jason appeared on the recovery floor moments later, feigning surprise at finding Owen there, and the two men stood face to face as Jason smiled and reminded Owen that a man who had already lost his job shouldn't try to fight an entire hospital. Owen answered calmly that he wasn't fighting the hospital at all. He was protecting it from the man who had turned a patient into nothing more than a number on a balance sheet. Jason, now aware that the backup security footage still existed, gave the order to destroy the entire server before sunrise. Abigail discovered a cyber attack already underway, systematically erasing data from the backup server, leaving her with roughly 30 minutes to copy whatever footage remained. Owen suggested spreading false information claiming David had woken and handed a storage drive full of evidence directly to Grace. Grace deliberately discussed this fabricated detail inside an office Abigail had just confirmed was bugged, setting the trap in motion. Exactly as they hoped, Jason abandoned his plan to erase the cameras, and instead focused on retrieving that supposed drive. Grace placed a decoy storage device inside her office safe, while Abigail positioned hidden cameras and trusted security personnel throughout the executive floor. Lucas stayed close to David and ordered a toxicology screening to determine whether he had been poisoned before his surgery had even begun. The results confirmed a small dose of a heart-slowing medication in David's bloodstream, a substance that had worsened his cardiac condition enough to force the emergency plegiacy procedure in the first place. The entire surgery, it turned out, had been engineered from the start. Owen dug through equipment records and discovered that Jason had never purchased the counterfeit components under his own name, instead using the identity of a deceased warehouse employee to approve every fraudulent order. Millions of dollars had flowed through Meridian Clinical Supply and into an investment fund Jason quietly controlled. Near midnight, Jason used Grace's own access card to slip into her office, open the safe, and removed the decoy drive, every movement captured by the hidden cameras Abigail had installed. When he realized the device held nothing of value, he understood immediately that he had walked straight into a trap. He locked down the executive floor, triggered a false fire alarm, and rushed toward the server room, desperate to finish what he had started. Owen intercepted him in a technical corridor, keeping his distance rather than engaging directly, buying time for Abigail to close in from behind. In a moment of mockery, Jason let slip a partial confession, sneering that the hospital only cared about profit and that people like Owen would always make the easiest people to blame. Abigail captured every word of it through the hospital's internal communication system. Then, without warning, Jason triggered the server room's gas-based fire suppression system, and if the door sealed shut, Owen and Abigail would be trapped inside with dwindling oxygen within minutes. Owen was forced to choose between chasing Jason down or turning back to save Abigail, who was now trapped behind a heavy steel door slowly filling with suppressant gas. Owen abandoned the chase and turned back for Abigail, using a technical tool to force open an emergency ventilation valve and pull her free before the air ran out. Jason fled toward the parking garage, only to find police officers already waiting for him, alerted by Grace the moment the alarm had gone off. The following morning, the hospital's board convened an emergency hearing to address everything that had happened. Jason insisted he had only entered Grace's office to protect confidential records, denying any tampering with hospital equipment and instead accusing Owen of manipulating Abigail into fabricating a story against him. Grace responded by ordering the restored security footage to be played in front of the entire board. The first clip showed Owen standing outside the operating room, repeatedly calling in warnings to the surgical team, using his emergency code only after David's heartbeat had already begun to fail. The next segment showed him inside the room, never once approaching the surgical incision, cutting the line to the faulty valve, switching to the backup oxygen supply, and pointing directly at the true reading on the secondary monitor. Seconds after that action, David's oxygen levels climbed back to safety. Lucas stood before the board and confirmed without hesitation that Owen had saved the patient's life. Another clip revealed Jason entering the supply cabinet before the surgery, swapping the pressure valve, and wiping down the handle to remove his fingerprints. A final piece of hallway footage showed him quietly pocketing the equipment label right after Owen had been dragged out of the room. Eleanor presented David's own audit records, financial trails proving that Jason had personally profited from every fraudulent equipment contract routed through Meridian Clinical Supply. Toxicology results confirmed David had been poisoned before his surgery ever began. Jason tried to shift blame onto a subordinate, but the recording from the technical corridor captured his own words, admitting he had chosen Owen as a convenient scapegoat from the very beginning. For a long moment after the recording ended, no one in the boardroom said a word. Jason sat perfectly still, the practiced calm on his face, finally cracking under the weight of his own voice, played back to him in a room full of people who had once trusted him without question. Even the board members who had known him for years found themselves unable to meet his eyes. The board immediately suspended every authority Jason held, and police arrested him on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, sabotage of medical equipment, financial fraud, and destruction of evidence. Grace stood before the entire board and admitted that she alone had fired Owen without ever giving him the chance to be heard, declaring his termination void on the spot. Owen did not rush to accept his position back. He asked first that the hospital issue a public apology and inspect every piece of equipment connected to Jason's fraudulent contracts. Once David regained consciousness, he revealed that the most important piece of evidence had never been inside the storage drive Jason had tried so desperately to steal. David explained that he had already sent a full copy of the financial records to federal investigators well before he had ever entered the hospital. The storage drive Jason chased so desperately had only ever contained a brief summary meant for the board meeting, and Jason had nearly killed a man over evidence that was never in danger of disappearing at all. Investigators expanded the case and discovered the same counterfeit components had been installed in 4 other hospitals across the region. A number of past incidents, once written off as unexplained surgical complications, were reopened for further review, and families who had spent years believing a loved one's death was simply bad luck finally began receiving answers they had long since stopped expecting. For some of them, the truth arrived too late to change anything except how they understood the past. For others still waiting on test results and pending surgeries at those same hospitals, it arrived just in time. Grace held a public statement, and in front of every camera and every member of staff, she acknowledged that St. Matthew had treated Owen unjustly. She did not soften the language or hide behind careful corporate phrasing the way Jason once had. She named exactly what had happened, that a good man had raised the alarm, that the people with the power to check his warning had chosen speed and convenience over caution, and that the hospital's failure to listen had nearly cost a patient his life. She made clear that he had never entered that operating room out of carelessness, but because every single person with the authority to listen had refused to hear his warning. Lucas stood beside her and admitted his own share of the failure, confessing that professional pride had blinded him to the true safety of his patient. Owen was offered a new role as Director of Medical Equipment Safety, granting him the direct authority to suspend any suspicious device without waiting on administrative approval. He accepted the position under 3 conditions. First, the hospital would hire an independent organization to inspect its entire equipment system from top to bottom. Second, every employee, regardless of rank or title, would have the authority to trigger an emergency stop the moment they identified a genuine danger. Third, the hospital would establish a fund to support families harmed by past equipment failures that had gone unexamined for years. The board agreed to every term without objection. Abigail was given full authority to rebuild the hospital's security infrastructure and protect future whistleblowers from retaliation. Lucas asked Owen to help train surgical teams to better recognize technical risk before it ever reached the operating table. David made a full recovery, and his completed report ultimately dismantled the entire fraud network Jason had built. Owen returned to the very operating room where he had once been dragged out in humiliation, and this time, the surgical team stopped working entirely just to hear what he had to say. 6 months later, St. Matthew became the first hospital in the state to adopt a safety reporting system that made no distinction based on rank or title. Equipment failures dropped sharply, and staff members who had once been too afraid to speak up began reporting risks the moment they noticed them. Owen no longer worked out of a basement office. His new workspace sat right beside the surgical wing, though he still made a habit of checking every machine himself each morning before anyone else arrived. Grace grew into a more careful and attentive leader, regularly inviting frontline staff into meetings that had once been reserved only for executives. A quiet professional respect developed between her and Owen, nothing rushed, and nothing forced into romance, because the change that truly mattered was that Grace had finally learned to listen before she judged. Lucas kept the photograph of the counterfeit valve's serial number in his office as a permanent reminder that a medical degree had never made anyone immune to error. Jason was convicted once the full weight of the financial and technical evidence became public record. In the final scene, Owen finished his shift and received a short call from Mia, who asked whether people had actually listened to him that day. He glanced through the glass of the operating room, where a young doctor was carefully writing down a warning from a member of the cleaning staff about an exposed electrical wire. Owen smiled and told his daughter that they had finally started listening to everyone. The story closes with Owen walking through the very hallway where he had once been publicly humiliated, but this time no one looked at him as the man who had broken into an operating room. Nurses nodded as he passed. A young surgeon held a door open for him without needing to be asked. Somewhere down that same corridor, a nameplate outside a small office now read Director of Medical Equipment Safety, and beneath it, taped quietly to the frame where only Owen would ever notice, sat a single photograph of a little girl grinning at the camera, waiting for her father to come home. They looked at him now not as the man who had broken the rules, but as the one man who had stepped forward at exactly the right moment, while everyone else around him had simply chosen to stand still.